I have to tell you, it's wonderful to be here and very exciting. And I'm feeling a little intimidated because Senator Grafstein was telling me that you've been incredibly attentive all day and that it's been a very engaging day. And to be the last person, I just don't want to screw that up. So I've been struggling with what I say. They give you these speeches when you're a minister. And they're very good speeches, but they talk a lot about the accomplishments of the government, which we're expected to talk about. Now, I'd like to try and put that aside. I'll do my obligatory tell you how wonderful we are part later. But I want to talk. I want to continue a conversation that I've become very privileged to be part of in the last 2 months since I was appointed to cabinet, and it's a conversation that I would like all of you to be part of. I want to just start it by trying to, on a very macro level, try to help you, if I may, understand the struggles that those of us in governments have today around trying to understand the rapidly changing environment and how do you create efficacy in public policy in a way that's enabling, meaningful, and catalytic in the economy, because it's very hard to do. And it's changed, and in some ways, many of the government's approaches to economic development are obsolete. And I think that's not just true here in Canada. I think it's a struggle around the world. I'll be quite frank, I look at places like Israel and Singapore, and I see some of the most entrepreneurial and innovative governments in the world. And those partnerships have to be very important to us if we're going to realize that. And so what do I mean it's changed? Well, I was born in 1957, and I still think this is the prevailing view. We had an industrial economy, and I think probably more accurately a production economy. In the late 50s in Canada, 2/3 of people went to work to make something for a living. It was the dawn of the rapid expansion of the auto sector. We had a very industrial economy, a very manufacturing economy, and we weren't involved in the manufacture and production of goods. We were involved with the production of food or the harvesting of resources. All of these were extraordinarily fixed assets, and as Conrad Hilton so famously said, in the middle of this industrial production revolution that really exploded in the middle of the last century, the three most important things about a business decision are location, location, location. And your proximity to resources, to trade corridors, your proximity to other large markets was probably the singularly most important thing. Public policy, if you remember it back then, and it wasn't that long ago, and in Canada, prior to Brian Mulroney, who I give great credit as a Prime Minister for transforming the nature of public policy with a great deal of courage. We tried to govern our economy from the edge and the frontier. We priced things at borders. We controlled the movement of people. Trade regulations and domestically marketing boards, the Federal Investment Review Agency. We were very concerned about ownership. We were very concerned about trying to subsidize and reduce the cost. Government activism in the market was a very commonplace across the political spectrum. And we really looked at a very nationalist kind of strategy. At that time, the world was quite polarized between the United States and the Soviet Union, so your trading sphere was really determined by your political alliances. If by the middle 80s, that's starting to change. We see the emergence of free trade zones in Europe and in North America. And it becomes somewhat threatening to politicians because part of the identity of being a successful politician was being a nationalist, right? In Israel, the emergence of the Israeli state. In Canada, our independence from the United Kingdom, our identity from the United States. We were very passionate. It was a very easy political win to wrap yourself in your national flag and run on a nationalist industrial policy, and both parties in this country, both the dominant parties, the conservatives and liberals, both in various ways. And it started to change with different people, with Brian Mulroney and continued with Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien in some ways, which was this idea that ownership didn't matter very much, and all of a sudden the borders were evaporating because of the internet and because of these integrated free trade zones. All of a sudden, all of those toolkits, as a matter of fact, not only weren't good anymore, they were destructive. you impeded the mobility of capital and you impeded the mobility of people, and you were on a rapid downward decline. And they were hard to sell here. It was hard to sell that kind of thing to people who were generally had a nationalist view most of their lives, and people who saw their job as something that they were hardwired into, that was a physical plant. And if it didn't have an assembly line, it wasn't a real job. Very hard to sell that. And people had a different attitude about work. People went and worked for a company for their whole life. You know, I remember when my dad started working for Johnson & Johnson, people stood there. You know, the only way you got ahead was you put your 30 years in and you were the vice president of sales, you know, or the director of marketing. I love watching Ad Men on television. You ever watch that show? I mean, it just, I'm sure, I missed the martinis at lunch, I'm sure, but, you know, the rest of it wasn't that untrue. Now you think about the economy today, like those were all measurable, concrete, immobile assets that made the politics of economics quite simple. Now we have highly mobile capital. You can move capital around the world in billions of dollars in capital around the world in split seconds. And we saw that in good times during the dot-com bubble expansion. We saw it devastating. I mean, look at little cities, small countries like Iceland, Reykjavik, one of the highest per capita growing GDPs in Europe, this great success story, everything from eyeglass design. The mayor of Reykjavik made all of his money in cell phone technology. Capital markets changed. It was over-leveraged. A very successful small country basically financially collapsed after being one of the poster boys. Ireland, you look at the Celtic Tigers and those. So the mobility of capital and mobility of people, governments don't know how to deal with. It's really been a struggle. And we don't even have national economies anymore. I mean, if you look at India and you look at Bangalore, the Bangalore regional economy is probably more similar to the Shanghai regional economy than it is to very many places in India, maybe other than Mumbai. One of the great successes of Singapore and Israel is that they are in themselves a singular regional economy with a unitary government. And that simplicity of having enough critical mass and at the same time sufficient talent. You look at the patents, level of patents in Israel is extraordinary, but they have one economy. Even in Ontario, we have about 5 different regional economies. Where my friend Steve Demings is from, it's a struggling resource economy trying to reinvent itself with new materials, new ideas about mining, the Ring of Fire strategy. Complex to look at how you introduce knowledge and innovation into a resource-rich, sparsely populated company. My family, half of them grew up in Sudbury. They're all miners. I mean, when I went to Sudbury and spent my summers there were 10,000 people working in the mines. And they worked in dirty. All my uncles died in their 50s of respiratory illnesses. Now there's 2,500, and they all work keyboards. Hardly any of them have a pick and shovel, or they work highly automated machinery. The employment shed is gone. The other thing that's happened for what you're doing, and I hope I'm giving you some context to our struggles so that we're more articulate about understanding each other's need, and I really wish that had gone on a little longer here because you were teaching me a lot of things, is that the mobility of capital and the mobility of people, the work of Kevin Stolaric, Richard Florida, Roger Martin, and others here about 2-3 years in a job, 1 year in a job in the United States, mobility between cities within 3 years. As Thomas Friedman says, you don't have to plug and play. You can plug and play anywhere in the world, and you don't have to emigrate to innovate. I mean, my entire family is here because they had to emigrate to innovate. To become part of a first world economy, you had to move to what was then defined as the first world. That mobility of people has made it very hard. You know, there's like 24 urban regional centers in the world that have rapidly expanding, that have about 3/4 of the creative workforce, the kinds of folks who need the capital that you need. And I'm guessing that most of you are looking for those emerging places and those places that are clustering those folks. That critical mass of people in those areas, our quality of place, our cultural life, our investments in our universities, our investments in our science, research, and development, in our transit system, the quality of our air, our ability to celebrate human diversity. In my constituency, which we're in, there's 160 languages spoken. Try to think about developing social cohesion and governments that doesn't leave anyone on the sidelines and doesn't make anyone feel marginalized. How do you create fluidity in a multicultural, complex society that allows everybody to participate, not just in the economy, but in leadership? And how do you manage all of those kinds of things? And if you look at cities that are late transformers to that, and one of the ones that's interesting to watch is St. Louis, the director of planning there, a very dynamic woman, says, how do you keep and build companies and people? Well, she says you have to do all things at all times, on all fronts. So you see, and I think I give Jim Flaherty huge credit for this, the alignment between the Ontario government and the government of Canada around sales tax reform. The HST, if you actually, have any of you gone through your accountants and look at, especially the SME sector, on how many millions of dollars in a mid-sized company is staying back there. And I just did a tour of Kitchener-Waterloo, which was very important because the model in Kitchener-Waterloo, the culture of that region has determined its success. It has the same laws that Toronto or Kingston or Ottawa has. It has access to the same markets, arguably more disconnected from the banking center than a business in the central or financial business district, but it's completely successful. So part of our innovation strategy has to not just be about the entrepreneur and the investor, it has to be about more than the business. You have to understand the culture of place and the sense of community, the values, the behaviors that get derived from those values, and how that affects the elasticity of people's ability to work in the marketplace and what they give themselves permission to do. And that can be as much identified to a cultural identity as anything else. So if you take two centers, you take Kingston. Anyone here from Kingston? It's a very important city. Queen's University, many of you may have heard of it, has Partech, which is the fourth most successful business incubator innovation company in the world. No business stays in Kingston for more than 3 years. Kingston's biggest export is people, successful companies, emerging technologies. Can't keep them. Great university, brilliant program, highly skilled people who can commercialize, but you can't keep a job in Kingston. What's the problem there? The culture is large institutional cultures. It's the home of Canada's biggest prisons. It's the home of our armed forces. It's the home of our hospitals. It has an institutional culture that is large, mostly public sector, mostly passive, mostly hierarchical. Kitchener-Waterloo, up until RIM and OpenText emerged, not a lot of big companies there. Lots of small SME companies, and a culture largely coming from the barn-building, collaborative nature of Mennonites from Central and Eastern Europe. People invest in each other's business. In my constituents here in Toronto, if I went to my friend Gord Nixon at the Royal Bank and said, you should write some big checks and help CIBC out to have a big breakthrough in the US market, I would get laughed out of the room as probably being a communist or something. But I can't find a successful business person with any depth in their pockets in Kitchener-Waterloo that hasn't written a check for their competitors.